Hi, this is author Rick Bleiweiss. Welcome to Chapter and Verse, and I'm here again with Howard Bloom, the absolutely fascinating Howard Bloom. And I hope you have watched the first episode that Howard and I did together, and we're picking it up now from where Howard started his own PR firm. So Howard, welcome and shoot away.
Well, thanks, Rick. So we left off in our last exciting adventure. Seymour Stein, the guy who founded Sire Records, but he also discovered Madonna, stuck his head into my cubicle at ABC Records and said, "Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company?" And then I was on the phone with Danny Goldberg, who was later the head of Polygram Records, where you worked, and of Atlantic Records. And he said, "Yeah, why don't you start your own company? Why don't you come up to my apartment on 74th Street? I've got a coffee table. I have an assistant. You can pay half her wages and get half of her time. And start your company." So I started my own company, the Howard Bloom Organization. And the intent was to have an organization. I never wanted to be caught in the kind of trap I was caught in at Circus, where I was hired to replace 2 people, and it took 5 people to replace me. I wanted to do the work of one person and do it well, which meant I needed a staff, an organization. But I didn't exactly have that in the beginning. And Stephanie Mills, who I had helped put on the landscape, on the map, especially with the Whiz, came with me. And there were 2 guys who had taken me out to lunch when I was at Circus Magazine. And it's very unusual to be taken out to lunch by 2 people, because you don't exactly establish a rapport with either of them.
Right.
You need one-on-ones to really get eyeball-to-eyeball contact with somebody. Nonetheless, they took me out to lunch and they stayed in touch with me. They were at Decca Records, and they had Al Green, who would later be a client of mine, unbeknownst to me. And they had a band called ZZ Top.
Yeah.
And I liked these guys. They were the only 2 people I ever invited to my family Thanksgiving.
Really?
From the record industry, right? And one of them was working with ZZ Top. The other one was about to establish disco music. And the one who, these guys had like 1,000% work ethic. Every waking second has to go to work. And they could see that in me. So one of them brought me ZZ Top as a client when I started my own company. And ZZ Top, that you have to understand what one of the members of this group called the Rock Crit Elite works.
Okay.
There was a Rock Crit Elite in the 1830s.
Okay.
And somebody, a friend of Thomas Carlyle in Germany, a fellow writer, was out in the countryside one weekend. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but at the edge of some farmlands, there are deep black paths, often in between rows of poplar trees. And if you take your girlfriend for a date in the countryside, sounds very romantic. It's not, because these paths are so narrow, they are literally this wide, that you have to walk in single file, and holding her hand becomes very difficult. Well, it turns out that these are sheep paths.
Oh.
So, and the sheep walk single file on these paths. So one day, this friend of Thomas Carlyle in Germany is out in the countryside, and he sees 2,000 sheep coming. And he decides to perform an experiment. He walks over to the path with his cane, and he sticks his cane in front of the lead sheep. So the lead sheep jumps over his cane. Then he withdrew the cane. There was no longer an obstacle in the path. Guess what the 1,999 remaining sheep did?
Jump.
They all jumped, exactly, when there was nothing to jump over. So this, Carlyle was bringing up this story to explain how the Rock Crit Elite of his day worked. In his day, the popular entertainment forms were theater and novels. And critics were just as important back then. It could make or break your career, just like they can today, and just like they could in the 1970s when I was starting the Howard Bloom Organization. The lead critic, the lead sheep, was at the Village Voice. And he had declared that ZZ Top has a sound that sounds like hammered shit. And it had become a 32-point headline in the Village Voice, which at that point was the lead sheep publication.
Right.
It was Robert Christgau who said that.
Remember,
and he was the king of the rock crit elite.
Yep.
He was the one who named the rock crit elite. So what Bob Christgau said went all across the country. To give you an example, once I was working with ZZ Top, I also was working with Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah Band.
Okay.
And the key press people, the lead sheep, the people at the New York Times and Bob Christgau loved Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah Band, and they loathed ZZ Top. So ZZ Top was doing a date in Minneapolis. I flew out there. I spent 3 days a week on the road with ZZ Top and 4 days a week in my office in New York. And when I was seated in the auditorium, the manager of ZZ Top had very wisely placed me in between the journalists for the two leading daily newspapers in Minneapolis. And on my left was a journalist reading the New York Times about my band, Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah Band. And at my right was another journalist reading Rolling Stone or the Village Voice about ZZ Top and how awful they were. So the concert was amazing. The audience was on its feet almost the entire concert. The frenzy over ZZ Top was enormous. And these two guys went back to their typewriters. And what did they write? The one on the left wrote an article praising Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah Band, aping the New York Times. The one on the right wrote an article about how ZZ Top, in slightly different words, had a sound like hammered shit, aping the Village Voice. That's how the press work. If you get one of these lead sheep to come out in favor of your act, 300 journalists all over the country repeated what that person had said. So the trick for me was always, if there is to find a valid story in my client, and look, Rick, we're all human. Almost all of us have valid stories. And once you tell a story of one human to other humans, it validates many of the experiences other humans have had that have never had words for.
Right.
So my job was to dig as deep as I could into ZZ Top. And frankly, I wasn't really getting anywhere. And then 6 months into the process, the management people called and said, there's this writer named Jim Pettigrew. He's got a story you have to hear. Call him. So I called him. And the story was that Billy Gibbons grew up listening to black music on a transistor radio under his pillow, coming from XRB, a pirate radio station that had incredible wattage and was able to reach all the way to Canada, but was in Mexico.
Right.
Wolfman Jack was the star. So he was listening to this really nitty gritty black music as a kid. His father was the leader of the leading debutante band in Texas. If you had a formal affair and you were rich enough, you hired him and his band. And they played for you. It was the Lester Lannon of Texas. We thought of it in those days. And his mother was active in politics. And when the first Texan president went to the White House, his mother went along with him as one of his assistants.
Wow.
So he was born into high culture, but he was glomming on to outlaw culture.
Right.
Basically, black culture.
Yep.
Which is outlaw culture for white kids.
Right.
And so meantime, Jim Pettigrew told me a story. Billy Gibbons had a friend on a ranch. And the friend with a ranch had a guy working for the ranch who was an absolute master at working with sucker gauge steel. Sucker gauge steel is that stuff that's about 3 inches by 3 inches and squared and flexible that you use to attach a windmill to the pump down below.
Okay.
So it's made to stretch 30 feet or so. and be strong enough to endure forever. So Billy and his friend went to this wizard of sucker gauge steel and asked him to build them big spherical cage and with a door, and to weld into it a bucket seat with a safety harness.
Really?
Yeah. And so then what they would do is they'd load this ball up onto the back of a pickup truck. One of the guys would strap himself into the bucket seat. They'd put up the flap. They'd go up Jackrabbit Road at 60 miles an hour, the highest speed that the pickup truck could do. And then the driver of the pickup truck would pull a rope, and that would open the flap. And this huge steel cage would come rolling off the truck and hit the highway at 60 miles an hour, sending up a rooster tail of sparks that was higher than the trees. So this was the first tale I had of what it was like to grow up in Texas, because I was about to realize something. I was so dumb. I missed for 6 months. One day we were sitting on the top floor of a hotel in a great big lounge, probably in Houston. And I was sitting with Billy and Dusty and Frank, the three members of ZZ Top. And they told me a story unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Texas, they said, is not what you think it is. The Texas Constitution says that Texas can withdraw from the Union anytime it wants. If you took a chainsaw, they said, and sawed right along the borders of Texas and set Texas floating out into the Gulf of Mexico, it would be the 6th largest economy in the world.
Okay.
Texas is not like the rest of the United States. In the rest of the United States, you have your founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. Not in Texas. In Texas, the founding father is Sam Houston.
Right.
We learn an entirely different history than you guys learn. And we have this whole culture that's uniquely our own, unlike any other culture in the 50 states. But when we go to San Francisco, we have to pretend we're from San Francisco, or we can't get anywhere because the rest of the country looks down on Texans. For example, Janis Joplin went to San Francisco from Texas, Port Arthur, and she had to pretend she was from San Francisco in order to be hip. What are they called? The albino guitarist, their brothers.
The Winters.
Yeah, Johnny and Edgar Winter.
Yeah.
Johnny and Edgar Winter are from Texas. They went to live with Steve Paul in Connecticut, and they pretended they were from Connecticut. Why? Because they were ashamed of Texas culture.
Wow.
They felt that if they revealed that they were a part of Texas culture and what Texas culture is, that they would be just shunned out of the music industry. And now the ZZ Top said, there are all these movements, the gay pride movement. Well, no, the gay pride movement didn't quite exist yet, but there was the black pride movement, and people were declaring they had a right to exist. They had a right to their subculture's unique identity.
Right.
And ZZ Top wanted to put together a tour to shove Texas culture in the face of the rest of North America, and to say, we are loud and we are proud, and this is who we are.
Right.
And ZZ Top had me go, well, they trucked me over to the White House, to the city capitol building of Houston, which was a low-lying construction, temporary construction building, or that's what it looked like. And they took me to the mayor of Houston, and she gave me a certificate naming me the ambassador of Texas culture to the world.
Wow.
We had this tour with a 75-foot wide stage in the shape of the state of Texas, tilted at an angle, so no matter where you were in a theater, you could see what its shape was, carried by 4 tractor trailer trucks, which had a continuous mural of the Texan landscape. 160 yards of landscape traveling along the highway on 4 trucks. We had a buffalo, a longhorn steer, 2 turkey vultures, and 3 rattlesnakes touring with us wherever we went. And this was the Taking Texas Culture to the World Tour. This was the I'm Loud and I'm Proud tour.
Okay.
When I realized what a gem we had, I mean, you look for authentic experiences that are interesting.
Right.
This was amazing, just astonishing. So I was able to use that. And by now, I had basically done a socio map of the critics to see who the lead sheep were.
Got it.
And I had learned which lead sheep had which proclivities. And my job was to take this damn story to the lead sheep.
Got it.
And ZZ Top gave me the perfect tool. They agreed to fly 10 major journalists from wherever they were to Texas, because ZZ Top was about to do its first dates in Texas after something like 3 years.
Okay.
And the crowds were screaming mobs for Texas. So they wanted the press to see this. Well,
Right.
the press people, journalists, cannot resist travel.
Yep.
They do not have high incomes at all. And so there are several things they cannot resist: travel, liquor, food. So I used to use a lot of travel, liquor, and food whenever I could pull it off with these people. So Rolling Stone, which was one of the lead sheep, assigned Timothy Ferris
Okay.
to cover this, to do a feature story on ZZ Top, but a feature story with respect, not with contempt.
That's great.
So, yeah, so Timothy Ferris and I flew down together, spent 5 hours in a plane going down to Texas together. Little did I realize Timothy Ferris was working with a guy named Carl Sagan
Really?
on a gold disc, explaining humanity
Right.
in the simplest terms, that would be sent into space, so that the first people from another solar system to encounter us would have some idea of who we were.
Right. I
Little
remember
did I
that.
realize Timothy Ferris was going to become one of the most award-winning science writers of our generation. And little did Timothy Ferris realize that this was just a field expedition for me into popular culture, that my base was theoretical physics and microbiology, and that I was putting together a panoptic view of the cosmos and where things like Adolf Hitler and rock and roll fit into. And I'd been doing this since the age of 12. Now I call it omnology. So Timothy and I have stayed in touch. But Tim did a story, and it was a very positive story on ZZ Top. And ZZ Top's credibility among the press went from minus 100 to plus 110
Wow.
overnight.
Wow.
And going out on tour with ZZ Top on this Taking Texas Culture to the World tour was remarkable. We had the bison, the buffalo.
Yeah.
Now, you go into a stadium and there are 3 or 4 floors with concrete floors, huge areas for trucks to drive in and park and unload.
Right.
And in one of these huge areas was totally cleared out. There was nothing going on in there, except over in the corner, there was a temporary iron railed corral. And inside that corral was the buffalo. And if you had to go through that room, the convention was you would go up against the wall, flatten up against the wall, trying to stay as far away from the buffalo as possible, because the buffalo had these 2 horns and it looked like he was going to turn you into a 2-ring notebook binder paper. So one day I was going up against the wall, avoiding the buffalo, and the buffalo rolled its melon-sized eyes at me, and something hit me. This buffalo doesn't look the way he looks because he wants to puncture you. He looks the way he looks because he's fucking lonely. So I left the wall behind, and I very gingerly inched across this huge concrete floor, inching toward the buffalo, measuring the buffalo's response. I finally got over to the buffalo, and I started to pet its nose, and I started to pet its forehead, and I started to rub its ears. And the buffalo took his head, which was the size of my torso, and leaned it up against my torso while I was rubbing
Wow.
his ears.
Wow.
And from that point on, the buffalo and I were friends. So one day, we were all in the corridor that leads to the underground just below the stage, because the buffalo and the longhorn steer go on these little pens that are on the top of scissor lifts.
Right.
And they start under the stage, where they're loaded onto these little platforms. And then the scissor lifts lift them up where the audience can see them, and the audience goes crazy. So the buffalo was being led down the corridor toward its scissor lift pen. And everybody was plastered up against the wall to let the buffalo pass. And then the buffalo saw me, and it diverted from its straight path to its scissor lift pen and came over and leaned its head up against me and wanted its ears rubbed.
Wow.
And there was nothing the buffalo handler could do about it, because the buffalo weighed a ton
Right.
and the handler weighed 140 pounds.
Right.
He was a little guy like me. So that's basically the story of the buffalo. The disease, I was like a family member, and they were like family members to me, the members of ZZ Top, and Bill Ham, their manager, who was a bloody genius. And then one day I got a call saying, we've left that little awful record company, Decca Records, and we're going with a real record company, Warner Brothers. And we're flying you out here for our first meeting with Warner's. So they put me up first class, now that they were getting millions, not hundreds of thousands. And I got on a first class plane to LA, and sitting next to me was a young lady, taller than I am, in all black top and black pants. And we started talking. And it turned out, okay, there was a film company that had been fabulously successful in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then by the 60s, it hit the wall.
Okay.
It made movies with budgets, but it couldn't sell tickets.
Okay.
Nobody was interested in the movies. So the record company was founded by a guy who was totally anti-Semitic.
Oh.
And who felt that his Oswald, he had a fight over a creature that he felt he had created called Oswald the Rabbit. The head of the film company, who was probably Jewish, also felt he had created Oswald the Rabbit, and they had a big fight over who owned Oswald the Rabbit when this animator quit. And that was another thing that added, I think, to his resentment. So he would not allow a Jew to be hired anywhere in his company.
Wow.
But the company was getting so desperate that they decided to pull off a strange maneuver and hire two of the forbidden people, two Jews. And the person I was sitting with was the assistant to one of these two Jews. Her name was Jane Rosenthal.
Okay.
And the company was called Disney. And the person they had just hired that was over her was Jeffrey Katzenberg.
Okay.
Now, this would all become relevant in my career later, very relevant in my career later. And that's how I established my rapport with Jane Rosenthal. And I got off the plane and made it to Warner's for this first meeting. And the first meeting was very strange because Bill Ham is a very quiet man. If anyone feels the humiliation of Texan culture, it is Bill Ham. And he very seldom, this is the manager for ZZ Top, the man who made them, that made their career. And so he is quiet most of the time. And you could see that these Brooklyn guys who had moved out to the West Coast, who were running Warner Brothers, had one body language. And Bill Ham and his team had a very different body language. And they also had different verbal languages. and they couldn't seem to find a common ground. And then they hit the topic of football.
Football.
And all of a sudden, they had a common language. And that's how they established their rapport. Now, look, you know, I was a child who was excluded from human society from the time I was old enough to even try to enter it. So I've never been a part of sports. I just, you know, I've been in a major movie about sports, about ice hockey. I'm in there describing the tribal patterns underlying what goes on with ice hockey teams. But I only understand sports the way a Martian would understand. So watching this thing unfold before my eyes was an amazing experience. And then after 3 years of working my ass off with 𝐬𝐫𝐞 and pulling off a complete perceptual turnaround in the press and in the public about 𝐬𝐫𝐞, and making 𝐬𝐫𝐞 almost the band that's the archetype of integrity, the archetype of genuineness. I think Bob Merlis at Warner Brothers, who was the VP of PR and who always had shipped something against me, I think he basically stole the band from me.
Really?
But they were up and running. I'd taken them from ground level to the jet stream, and now they were going to retain that validity, that sense of honesty, authenticity. So that was 𝐬𝐫𝐞. Meantime, I told you there was 2 guys who had taken me to lunch from Decca Records when I was at Circus Magazine. And I didn't understand why they were taking me to lunch together instead of one at a time. Well, the same month that I was named the ambassador of Texas culture to the world by Bob Small, who had put me in touch with 𝐬𝐫𝐞, I got a call from Ray Caviano, the other guy who'd been at that lunch, with whom I had a very intense, positive relationship, because I loved his workaholism. And Ray said, I know that your Mondays are sacred to you. I know that you lock yourself in, you go over every single campaign with every single one of your publicists so that you can give it attention. And I know you won't allow anything to interrupt that. But I'm telling you, I am coming in from Fire Island tomorrow morning, Monday, and you have to be in my apartment on 56th Street when I get off the seaplane. Okay, I took Ray very seriously. This is the only time I ever broke that ritual for anyone, and I showed up at his apartment. And Ray, I had known, because we were friends, work friends, I had known that Ray had become obsessed with European high-tempo dance records.
Okay.
I had known that there was a gay community on Fire Island, but it was very discreet and tried to hide itself, tried to look as if it didn't exist. And Ray told me this story. He had filled a suitcase with high-tempo dance records. He'd taken it out to Fire Island. He was gay. This is not something I had ever suspected, because he was as macho as could be. And he had started playing these high-tempo dance records to gatherings in the gay community. And in the gay community, it was totally forbidden to show outsiders that you were gay.
Okay.
So you didn't do what was about to happen when Ray played these records. These men started dancing with each other, which was shocking at the time.
Yeah.
Simply wasn't done.
Right.
And when you dance, a strange thing happens to you. You are taken over by the gods inside. You go into some sort of trance-like state, and something higher than you are, something deep inside you, like a flame within you that connects with a flame outside of you, comes to life and utterly takes you over, especially if you're stoned in some way.
Right.
So the gods inside, which I had been in pursuit of since I was 12 years old, were leaping like fire out of these men when they danced. And you would think, now a little inset here. When I first came to New York with my best friend at the age of 16, one of the things that amazed me was transvestites. We didn't have them in Buffalo, New York.
Right.
So these people who looked like women, acted like women, but were actually men. And then I had been walking on Bleecker Street on my way to my girlfriend's apartment, and somebody from across the street started shouting my name. And I looked, and I walked across the street to see what it was all about. And, you know, if you're one of those students who in an amphitheater with 110 students stands out because of the quality of his dialogue with the professor, a lot of people know you who you don't know.
Right.
So this was an NYU student who had a job as a barker at a club called the 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, look, if you ever need a place just to hang out, use our dressing room. So on Saturday nights, I used to go out on dates, and I would take the girl I was dating to the train station so she could go back home to New Jersey. And I'd come over to the 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭 at 11:30 at night. And with my yellow pad in my hand, I would write, "Dear Mom and Dad, nothing interesting happening in New York." However, I happened to be in the dressing room of the leading transvestite nightclub in New York City. And while I was writing these words, Marilyn Monroe imitators, Bessie Smith imitators, Diana Ross imitators were coming off the stage, men, all of them men.
Right.
And they were ballsy as could be in their alter ego, in the people that they were imitating, the women they were imitating. And then they would take off their false hips and take off their false breasts and slither into one-piece leather jumpsuits with a zipper from the groin up to the neck, and all of a sudden transform. And wearing this male clothing, they would suddenly become swish, which they never were as women.
Right.
So that's what I thought would come out of these guys in Fire Island dancing with each other. But that's not the guys within that came leaping out of these people. What came leaping out of these people was a 4-year-old's first views of what manhood is all about.
Okay.
Firefighters, policemen, sheriffs, Indian chiefs, all the fantasy figures of a 4-year-old boy came just roaring out of these people. And Ray said, okay, when you leave here, meaning his apartment, you're going to go over to 57th Street. Remember, we're on 56th Street. There are 2 of the biggest newsstands in the world there. And these are the 20 publications you're going to buy. And I'd never heard any of them. So I went over to the newsstand. Indeed, they did have these publications. They gave them to me in a brown shopping bag. They embarrassed the shit out of me. None of them were visible. They were all behind the counter.
Right.
And I took them to my office, wondering what my staff was going to think. Because I learned that men are useless in PR. They talk a great game. They don't deliver a thing.
Okay.
Women just deliver, period. They're not there to talk about how great they are. And so all my staff by now was women. They called themselves Howard's Angels. And I thought, what is my staff going to think of these magazines, each of which has a 2-page spread at the center, a centerfold, with some guy and his schlong.
Right.
They're going to reject me. They're going to reject this whole project. So I put the shopping bag in a corner of my office, and it was like honey and bees. All the women came crowding into the corner of my office that had the brown paper bag. And they were comparing schlongs. I had never heard anything like it in my life. They were fascinated by the schlongs. But thus, Ray Cavallano, in the same month when Bob Small had gotten me named the ambassador of Texas culture to the world with ZZ Top, Ray Cavallano made me the spokesman for the gay community, trying to do exactly what ZZ Top was doing with Texas culture, trying to come out of the closet and say, I'm loud and I'm proud. So I got to work with two subcultural upheavals.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, at once. And remember, I'm coming at this from the point of view of science. So to see a subculture upheave and how it does it and to contribute to its success is an astonishing privilege that no scientist I'm aware of has ever had anything like before.
Probably right.
So the new music that Ray was promoting was called disco. And of course, ZZ Top was Texas. So that was the beginning of the Howard Bloom organization. And another interesting thing happened. So eventually, very rapidly, actually, I got too big for Danny Goldberg's coffee table. And I rented an office of my own on 55th Street. And it was in the same building as a new law firm, Grubman and Endersky.
Oh yeah, I know them well.
Yeah, and Alan Grubman at that point was not well known, but he was on his way to becoming the most powerful attorney in the music industry.
Yep, he was.
And my office wasn't ready on the date when it was supposed to be. They were still painting it. Alan Grubman gave me his personal office for 2 weeks to use.
Wow.
While we waited for the painting. It was an act of generosity. Alan Grubman is known for his absolute fist-like toughness.
Oh, yeah.
But there was apparently kindness in this man. My adventures, which you can find in How I Suddenly Started the 60s, start with the kindness of 3 murderers, which I didn't expect to see when they first picked me up on a highway heading from Seattle down to San Francisco.
Wow.
So yes, there's kindness in all kinds of people. And so now I had this office, and I really only used one room at first. So the other room was rented from me by Bob Caviano, Ray's brother.
Okay.
And Bob Caviano was managing, Grace Jones.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And was also a major figure. Bob Caviano was the engine of the gay community and its music disco.
Okay.
Bob Caviano was not just along for the ride, he was active too, but nowhere near as central as his brother was. But people used to come in and he let them use his office. And there were these 2 guys from France. Now, disco was developing something that had really never quite existed before. The transvestite community and the gay community tended to be centered around 10th Street and West Avenue, okay, on the river. And it was an industrial community that had been abandoned. It had been the meatpacking district. Right. Now it was empty real estate. And they started taking over spaces in this empty real estate and turning them into dance clubs. Yeah. And so initially, I was able to describe to you what had gone on with Fire Island as if I'd been there, but I've never been to Fire Island in my life because I got the story out of Ray.
Right.
And I was able to describe to you what was going on in the dance clubs of New York City, these new things, again, because I got the story out of Ray. I didn't have to go there. One night, Ray said, they're opening a new club. You absolutely have to be there. Well, I took Ray's orders seriously.
Yeah.
So that night, another record company president, whose company I represented, said, look, I have a problem. I'm meeting with this potential star. I'd like to sign her. I need you there. So I committed to going to dinner with this person that he wanted to sign, whose name was Tina Turner.
A small signing. One of my favorites.
And apparently I was his lure. His major claim to fame was that he used me. And Tina was one of the very few people I've ever met whose eyes shine like laser beams. Now, I don't know if that's because of cocaine or that's for real. I just don't know. I don't know if it's natural. But Tina was wonderful. And she told me, this is astonishing, she told both of us this astonishing story. She wanted to be a singer when she was 16 years old. She went to St. Louis, which was the big city. She was snapped up by Ike Turner, which seemed like a fabulous stroke of luck. And then Ike made her into basically a sex and singing slave.
Yeah.
He locked her in his studio. She was there all day. She was there all night in his big bedroom with a round bed with a mirror over it. She was there while Ike was taking one Ikeette after another up to that big bed, and cheating on her. And she thought she'd never be able to get away. And then at one point, she started getting into one of the, I think, Zen Buddhist traditions. It's Om Rom Shikyu or something like that, where you chant Om Rom Shikyu, and she felt her head was cleared out and she needed to get away from Ike. So she found herself a place in the suburbs and escaped. And then Ike, to show that she still belonged to him, firebombed her lawn. He put M80s, half dynamite sticks, all around the lawn, and then set them all off, just as a warning. Her, and then she was ready to start her solo career. So the story was fabulous, but I said to her toward the end of the meal, Tina, I'm due to be downtown at 9 o'clock because I'm supposed to go to a dance club that I've never seen before. Would you like to come with me? So Tina and I got into a cab around 57th Street and cabbed down to this empty industrial district. And it was scary. The buildings were huge. They were only 4 stories high, but they were huge in depth and width. And they were dark because they were empty. Nobody was using them. So we hoped we were following the correct instructions. We hoped we'd gotten off at the correct address. And we went up a stairway and we went down a dark corridor, a long dark corridor, Tina behind me on her 7-inch heels. And then we started approaching the light at the end of the tunnel, literally, which was the light coming through a doorway from a 2-story high room inside that was lit brightly. And as we walked toward the door, we could begin to see what was going on. And what was going on was you had these guys in skinny little vests who were muscle builders and who had oiled their muscles, and they were all tanned and they were flexing their biceps. And there were little wispy guys with little wispy mustaches hanging from those biceps as if they were trapezes. It was an astonishing sight. Now, once upon a time, in my days hitchhiking and riding the rails and accidentally helping found the hippie movement, back in the early 1960s, a kid had wanted to leave San Diego with me. This is a kid who went into a bar every night and told these astonishing stories of his amazing adventure. But in reality, he finally confessed to me he'd had none of them. They were all imaginary. He was working for the post office on the way to undergraduate school, on the way to college. And he asked if he could come up to San Francisco with me to experience the group that was gathering around me, a group that didn't have a name yet. So I took him, and we arrived in San Francisco at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we went into the big room that my gang, my tribe, rented, and it looked empty. It looked like it had burlap bags on the floor, but aside from that, it was empty. And then the burlap bags began to stir. And it turned out they weren't burlap bags at all. They were sleeping bags.
Okay.
And one of the female leaders of the group, one of the female catalysts, saw me and screamed, "How?" And jumped out of her sleeping bag. And then others began to jump out of their sleeping bags. Now, Rick, in those days, my little tribe wore 0 clothing.
Okay.
None. And this kid, when he saw what was going on in this room, fled.
Really?
When I was finished with all the people heaping themselves upon me and hugging me, I had to go out and find him. And I found him 2 stories down below or something like that at floor level. He was shocked out of his boots. It's the first time I ever saw that kind of reaction.
Yeah.
Now coming down this dark corridor in the meat packing district with Tina Turner, I saw that kind of shock for only the second time in my life. Tina, despite all she'd been through, watching Ike work the members of the Ikettes, this was more than she could handle.
Wow.
And she turned around on one of those 7-inch heels of hers and got out of there. And I have no idea of how she got transport uptown, because this was a forlorn district and we didn't have cell phones
Right.
in those days.
Right.
Nonetheless, that was my Tina Turner story. This was the beginning of the Howard Bloom Institute. And it turns out that for most of my career, I would discover I would be not just making individual superstars. Individual superstars are the tongue of a group that is trying to articulate its identity.
Okay.
And articulates that identity through that person, which is why I said, if we sat you down, we got the story of your life. There are a lot of people who would find that validating because it contains elements that they've never been able to put into words and have felt they needed to hide all their life. Well, when you have 100 kids who have had to hide most of what their identity is, right up until 14 or 15 years old, when they've come to see you, and you go on stage and you are your most authentic self, if you are fortunate, you become a tongue for that group. These kids have felt that they were alone in the world up until now, that they didn't dare express any of their experiences. They didn't have words for their experiences. But if they told people about their experiences, they would be considered lunatics. They would be shunned. They would be thrown out of the group. And now you've got 100 in a room, and they suddenly realize they are not alone. And sometimes you get 10,000 in a room, and sometimes you get 100,000 in a room. And sometimes you end up as the voice of 100 million people who haven't had a common identity before. Those people have realized they're not just alone, they are a movement. And that's what you achieve for them. Country and Western was the music of a subculture trying to find a voice and declare its right to exist and get respect outside of the ghetto of the Bible Belt. Disco was that for the gay community. ZZ Top was that for the Texas community. And I would continue to discover that an authentic artist is the tongue of a group, expresses the soul of a group. And that expression may not be in words, Rick. It may just be in body language. It may just be in the posture that a John Mellencamp takes, that a Billy Idol takes, which is radically different from what a John Mellencamp takes, or a Joan Jett takes, which is similar to a Billy Idol, but it's a female. It's a whole different kind of statement coming from her. And so one of the things that's been hardest for me to figure out is how, through body language, a star articulates the common identity of a group, the soul of a group. But that's what a star does. But to do that, if you want to be a star, you have to be a person who eats, drinks, and breathes music, who wants to make music more than anything else in life, who wants to be performing in front of an audience more than anything else in life. And then that person has to have a special magic that it is hard to describe. Why did I know that 𝐶𝐭 Khan would be a star? I heard it in her record. I never even met her. And was I accurate? I mean, that was the first time I ever predicted, you cover my ass with the band and I will give you a star. Did it work? Yeah, 𝐶𝐭 Khan's become an icon. How you sense that element is it's in your gut. It's like the first time I saw Elon Musk, which I probably told you about. And I saw him tell a simple story. When I got out of college, he said, I asked myself, what 3 things will do the most to change humanity in my lifetime? And my answer was the internet, alternative energy, and space. So I
Okay.
went into the internet, he said, and I helped build PayPal. And then I came out of it with close to $1 billion. And I skipped alternative item number 2, alternative energy, and I went directly to space. And Rick, he hadn't even put a firecracker in a tin can and launched it. He had launched nothing, and NASA was mocking him.
Right.
This was in 2005. And my gut said, that's a superstar. Kids will be imitating his example 110 years from now.
Yep.
So I had 4 conversations with him. And I cannot tell you why I couldn't tell him why I had those conversations, because it took me a long time to realize it was because that thing in my gut was saying, this is a mythic figure.
Yep.
Icons change the way we do things.
Yep.
Because icons formulate a common identity for a group. And Elon is doing that right now. And in the process, if he stays alive long enough, changing the very face of what American industrial society is. So, yeah.
Howard, I'd like to ask you something, because we don't have a lot more time today. And I assure you, if you're up for it, we're going to do a few more of these to go through the writing and everything.
Right.
But I would like you to just talk a little bit about Prince, because I seem to remember that you had a significant impact in changing him to be a more mass artist. Am I correct?
We didn't change him, because you're always looking to take what's there,
right,
and to bring it to the public.
Right.
And Bob Caviano and Ray Caviano and Bob Small trained me when I started my own company. They said there are 3 trade magazines, Cashbox, Record World, and Billboard.
Right.
They come in on Monday morning. Monday morning is a ritual. You have to read all 3 of them from cover to cover. It was a very interesting lesson. So I was reading every Monday the 3 trade magazines from cover to cover, and I noticed that there was an artist rising on the R&B charts that I'd never heard of before. Then I realized that artist had gone platinum with an album, and I'd never heard of him before. And I found that phenomenon.
Yeah.
Really interesting. And then I got a call one day. I was working with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Earth, Wind, and Fire's manager was Bob Cavallo. And the caller said, Bob Cavallo wants us to work on Prince. Are you interested? Well, Prince is the artist I had been following with absolute fascination. And my response was absolutely yes. But nobody knew anything about Prince, who he was at that point. And I got a call from Warner Brothers in California. And Warner's black publicity department was not like the black publicity department in other companies. Black publicists in other companies could be inarticulate and street level, and but the people in black PR at Warner Brothers, like Princeton and Harvard level people. So I got a call from one of these Princeton, Harvard level publicists saying, you really want to work with Prince? He can't do interviews. We set him up for 2 interviews. He said absolutely nothing to the first interviewer, and he tried to strangle the second interview. So I was developing secular shamanism. Secular shamanism was finding the gods inside of you,
right,
and using them to rouse the gods inside of your audience. I had come to the point where I made a demand of people who came to work for me. This is what I told you if you wanted to come to work for me, and it's relevant to Prince. If you expect me to fashion an artificial mask for you and to sit here like a guy in a plaid suit with a cigar in his hand saying, kid, with this image, I'm going to make you a star, I'm going to send you to my best competitor, to Rogers and Cowan. I'll have you in their office in 2 hours.
I knew them well.
Yeah. So if you're going to work with me, you have to understand, music is not about an exchange of pieces of plastic. It's not about an exchange of downloads. It's not about an exchange of money. It is about an exchange of human soul. And if I work with you, I'm going to spend 6 weeks studying every lyric you've ever written, every album cover you've ever put out, every interview you've ever done. And then I'm going to insist on coming to see you in your environment, not mine, with no handlers, no managers, no wives, no assistants, just you and me. And my task is going to be to find the gods inside of you. What do I mean by the gods inside of you? You sit down at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to write a lyric. If you're most writers, you're absolutely sure you could never write a lyric. You have no idea of how you've ever written a lyric in the past. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on a reasonably good day, there's a lyric in front of you.
Right.
And once or twice in your life, that lyric is so perfect that it feels like it wrote itself through you.
That's right.
I'm going to find the gods inside of you to write those lyrics. When you go on stage on a really good night, you see the eyes of the audience widening. You see their faces melting. You see them melt into a giant communal blob like a great big amoeba.
Yep.
You see that amoeba reach a pseudopod like a tunnel out to you and send its energy through you. You become an empty pipe. You think you're on the ceiling watching all of this take place. You are danced like a marionette. You feel that energy come through the empty pipe of you, somewhere around your head. You feel it be utterly transmogrified. You feel it flowing back down through you to the audience, and you see if their pupils widen even farther.
Right.
And it's a continuous feedback loop.
Yep.
I'm going to find the gods inside of you that dance you on stage in these experiences. And then I'm going to introduce those gods inside of you to you.
Cool.
So I made this demand of Bob Cavallo for Prince. Prince was rehearsing for his Dirty Minds tour.
Okay.
In Buffalo, New York, not his home territory. That was my hometown.
Right.
He was rehearsing in a place called the Shea Theater, which I went to when I was 11 years old to see a movie. But this is Prince's environment because it's a theater. And Prince is rehearsing on stage with his band. So I sit and wait for the end of the rehearsal. And Prince and I, at 1 o'clock in the morning, are looking around backstage for a room we can lock so we can be in there privately.
Right.
We find the room, we sit there, we talk, I interview him until the sun rises.
Wow.
Prince, who I was told you cannot do interviews.
Wow.
And I asked him, and this question is so ridiculously simple-minded, just appalling, but I asked him, what is the first memory of music? When is the first time you liked music? And Prince said, when I was 5 years old. My dad was a jazz musician, and my mom took me to see him in rehearsal. And we walked into a theater like this theater, and all the seats were pointed at the guy in the middle of the stage, and the spotlight was on the guy in the middle of the stage. And behind him were 5 of the most gorgeous women I've ever seen in my life. And that guy was my dad.
Wow.
But it was the 5 most gorgeous women in his life. You could tell from the way he said these sentences. That was the clincher. So Prince has been into music ever since. Then when Prince was a teenager, his best friend Andre Simone's mother had a basement that nobody ever used. So Prince founded a new community in that basement.
Oh.
And the law of that community was the law that my group had helped promulgate something like 10 years earlier. Make love, not war.
Right.
And so every kind of sexuality was involved, was allowed down there. Now, how Prince got women to have sex with is beyond me, because he was about 5 feet tall. He was a tiny little guy.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and it took me 3 years to realize it, Rick. I always thought he was my height or taller.
Yeah.
Because his aura
Right.
is so strong. His charisma is so strong. So then I said, Prince, okay, look, I'm going to put your story, the story you've told me, together as a coherent story, but it's all going to be your words. And then I'm going to send it to you. And I want you to tell this story to every journalist you meet. and I'm going to set you up in New York for 3 days of interviews. You're going to do 8 interviews a day, and I'll send you to LA for 8 interviews a day for 3 days. And when a journalist walks into the room, he's going to ask you a really stupid question, like, how do you categorize your music? Your job is to tell this story, no matter how stupid the question is. And you must avoid, you will be tempted to say, as I told the previous journalist. No, you are not allowed to say that. You have to treat this the way you treat a stage show when you redo your hits, and you do them as if it's the first time you've ever done them.
Right.
You have to be like a prostitute. You have to pretend you've never done this with anybody else in your life. And that journalist who asked you the stupid question will go home to his wife that night, because they were all men in those days, and he will say, honey, I'm brilliant. I asked this absolutely astonishing question of this kid named Prince, and I got this astonishing story out of him. So, and your job is to understand that the press person you're talking to is a megaphone, that the people you're really talking to are the readers, your audience.
Right.
So Prince did it. He did those 48 interviews, and he did them well. And then he insisted that I give this training to everyone he worked with.
Really?
In 1981, I picked up, I used to take this huge red leather thing with 30 pounds of paperwork in it home, so I could do paperwork over the weekend. I was a 7-day-a-week worker, and I needed my papers with me because we didn't have computers in those days. One day, I picked up, the elevator was arriving at my office. I leaned over, pirouetting on just one leg to pick up this extremely heavy bag, and I heard something literally pop in my back.
Oh, wow.
And it kept getting worse and worse and worse over the summer. And then in the fall, I got a call from Jamie Shoup, one of Bob Cavallo's people. And Jamie said, Prince has this new band, The Time, and you have to do for them what you did for him. And I said, Jamie, I'm in bed naked. I have got a hospital tray, a wheelie hospital tray over the bed with 3 of my 7 Rolodexes and a phone. And that's how I'm functioning right now. And I don't know when I'm going to be out of this bed. And Jamie said, give me your address. We'll be there at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Well, one of my best kept secrets was my apartment. I never wanted anybody here, with the exception of Bob Flower. Yeah, it's not just a sanctuary. My wife and I lived like church mice. We lived like students. So our furniture was all furniture dragged in off the street. And my wife, at one time or another, had rescued 80 cats.
Wow.
And so the cats had clawed away all of the stuffing, all of the covering from the chairs. And so I didn't want any, I mean, I knew that sometime in my 40s, this thing I loved, working 7-day weeks and 16-hour days, was going to take its toll on me.
Right.
I would become sick in some way. I couldn't tell in what way, but I would not be able to do the work it takes to make a living. I knew that. And so our money did not go into fancy furniture or anything for show. The whole apartment was a big office.
Okay.
I mean, Stereo Review in 1981 did an article on this apartment as the ultimate next generation technology apartment in the days when we had technology that was so primitive, it defies belief. But at any rate, so the next day at 11 o'clock in the morning, a black limousine rolled up to my door. This neighborhood was a slum at the time. So that was something that had never happened before.
Right.
Out of the left-hand side, in the passenger seats behind, came a gorgeous California blonde, Jamie Shoup. Out of the right-hand door came a man dressed in a zoot suit that was so immaculately pressed, it looked as if he had a woman with an iron in the car. And the two of them rang my buzzer. My wife went downstairs to get them. They came up 3 floors of stairs with dust bunnies the size of dinosaurs. And they arrived at the apartment, and we had 2 dogs. And they were big. And one dog greeted Morris Day by goosing him from the front. The other greeted Morris Day by goosing him from the rear. And Morris was led into my bedroom, where my wife had thrown a sheet over one of these chairs that have been reduced to springs and framework. And I, for the occasion, had put on clothes. So I was still laying there in the bed. And I got Morris's life story to the best of my ability and made a transcript of it, putting together in chronological order. So you can see the story, because people don't necessarily remember things in order. And got it to Morris and trained Morris on how to do interviews. Then Prince flew me out to Minneapolis to do the training for Vanity. Then Prince flew me out to the place where he was, to the motel he'd taken over to make a film. It was all very hush-hush and secretive, and had me do it with one of his proteges who never came, she never took off. And then Prince had me do it for Wendy and Lisa.
Okay.
And then Prince had me do it for the woman he found to co-star with him in his second movie, Under the Cherry Moon. And that was, oh God, what is her name? I love her. And she's a friend, or we exchange emails. She was in The Horse Whisperer as the mother.
Oh, yeah.
She was in salmon fishing in the Oman, which is a tremendous movie.
I know exactly who you're talking about, but the name's not going to come to me.
She got an Academy Award nomination for The English Patient. She's had tons of awards in Britain. Kristen Scott Thomas.
There you go.
And Kristen Scott Thomas was one of the most impressive people I've ever met in my life. So Prince considered me the University of Howard Bloom.
And you were.
Well, to the best of my abilities.
You still are.
I was the secular shaman to the best of my abilities. So that's where we should cut off for today. And then we can get into more Prince and Michael Jackson next week, because Michael Jackson was the most remarkable experience I'd ever had in my life and have ever had in my life. It was a privilege beyond belief.
Well, then definitely we have to talk about that. And the next session, I want to talk about Farm Aid as well.
Ah, okay, Farm Aid, yes.
But we'll start with Michael Jackson.
Okay. And meanwhile, let's hope by the time I see you next, we'll have more achievements from the Howard Bloom Institute.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about the Howard Bloom Institute, and we'll talk about your books and your writing in one of these as well, because I want to cover your whole life. I mean, it's too fascinating not to. Seriously, I mean that.
Wonderful.